I want to begin with a disclaimer. I'm not running for any public office.
Oh, come on.
But if you have a maple leaf movement started by our friends over here, I will immediately sign up. Thank you so much on a working day, as it is today, to take the time and come out this evening to join the International Free Press Society and so many of my friends, and Beyond, and Mary Lou. I could spend the whole evening thanking each one of you, seeing faces from way back when we had a campaign about 10 years ago or a little longer, and we sowed the seed, or at least some of us sowed the seed. I'm thinking going back to the mid-1990s, and Lynn is way back hiding there. There's the casualty of going back. But I'll do what professors do. We walk around. Going back quite some time now, to think about it, when we were foot soldiers in the reform movement and sowed the seed for what we now today have, a government, a conservative government, and a prime minister who has the conviction and the courage and the heart and the mind to say things that needs to be said, unlike the prime ministers we've had before. Isn't this wonderful? Well, Beyond suggested that I say something. I want my book to be say whatever I have to say, and I'm really grateful that so many of you have picked up a copy, and I hope with the support of Beyond, and particularly Beyond and Mary Lou and the IFPS Canada, and now with Lars coming in, I told my little girl that I've been reading Hans Andersen to her in years, Hans Andersen, that he came in for this evening, that we can get the message out, the message that is not only the message that I'm trying to get across in my book, but the message that is beginning to reverberate now. Charles Adler the other day mentioned that in his opening words in talking about my book, that David Cameron and Angela Merkel have now announced that official multiculturalism is a failed policy. And so what are my thoughts? And I couldn't miss the opportunity. I said, finally they're catching up with me. But I hope we can get the message rolling. But where did the message come from? I thought I'll just share a little story. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I took a little girl on a road trip down south, and we visited Philadelphia and New York and other places in a little trip that we made. And I wanted to take my daughter and show her the Statue of Liberty, and we cruised around the island and we saw, and so that when she comes home, as she did, and began a school this week, she will have stories to tell her friends, and she goes to grade 2 now, and teacher will be asking what they did over the summer. And so that was one of the purposes that I had in mind. And we had a great time taking her to those places. And then we were in line in Philadelphia to see the statue, to see the Liberty Bell. I had seen the Liberty Bell for the first time in America's bicentennial year. That was in 1776, a long time ago. Been back a couple of times, but this time I had my little girl in my arms, holding my hands, and we were walking and reading in the museum where the bell is kept in Philadelphia, little background history. And while reading some of the stuff there, with Ines dragging and pulling me, I came across this little story, which I want to share with you. It was about the bell. And as you all know, this was the bell that heralded the Independence Day, July 4th, 76. It was the bell that rang on that morning in America. But this bell soon after fell silent. it developed a crack, and the crack grew wider, and the bell never again rang. It stands there, or it sits there, it's held up there now, as the bell that rang on July 4th, 1776, but it has gone down. And as I was reading that story with my little girl, it struck me. It made me once again aware of what I knew, but that story was so poignant and so immediate that the bell of freedom went down. Freedom is extremely fragile, and for it to go down, it doesn't take much time. It has to be asserted and reasserted and fought for, because the forces against the freedom movement, which that bell represented, is huge, and our history in that sense can be signified by the symbol of that bell, and it brought everything together. And so what Lars just said this evening and shared his thoughts with us brings it home, that we have to stand up. So my book, the title of it is Delectable Lie, a liberal repudiation of multiculturalism. Liberal, by the way, with small L. It's got nothing to do with the Liberal Party. And I keep reminding my interviewer that it's got nothing to do with the big L Liberal Party. In fact, that is the party, whether the Liberal Party in North America, in Canada, or the Democrats in the United States, or the Liberal Party of Britain, the party of Lloyd George and Henry Ascott and others. That's the party that got thoroughly corrupted in the 20th century and faded away and abandoned the principle which was the basis of that party, that is, the question of freedom, the rule of law, and freedom based upon individual rights. And what I have tried to do, we talk a great deal about, in these last few years we've been talking about, and I was writing about it, especially after 9/11, about multiculturalism and how it is the chokehold in our throat. And Elias Canetti, the great Bulgarian Nobel Prize-winning author, he said, and I quote him right at the outset, the origin of freedom lies in breathing. And I began to feel after 9/11, which we will be commemorating in a couple of days' time, that multiculturalism was a chokehold for us. It was suffocating us. And so what I then decided that, we have to put it in some sort of a measured context. We have been drifting all over the place. We've been writing all over the place. And so I went back to do that last year. And I found, to my surprise, there has been no serious effort to engage philosophically with this issue that was invented right here in Canada, as Lars reminded us, and then went across Western Europe and is also trying to contaminate the United States. But there was no serious study. In 1990, Neil Bissundat, another brown guy like me, coming in from Trinidad in the Caribbean, he wrote a book, and that was in 1991, 1992, if my memory serves me, called Selling Illusion. But that was a long time ago, and it was anecdotal, but nobody had done it. And so that's what I've tried to do. To put it very quickly, and not taking too much time. The professors have a habit of going on and on and on, and I'm looking at my professor colleague, Ben Singer, and remind that that's one of our great flaws, and we drift away, so I don't want to do that. To put it very succinctly, what I have done or tried to do, and it will be up to you and the reviewers and others to gauge whether it has been successful or not, is to put it in the context of the fundamental value for which begins and which has come to define the West, a struggle that goes on or went on over roughly 500 years, or more than 500 years. We can even go as far back as to Magna Carta. But for the 5 centuries, definitely, in the making of the modern West, that is liberal democracy. So I went back. That is the fundamental paradigm, the fundamental framework which makes the West what the West is and has been the great success story of our history. And because these ideas evolved and developed in the West, and West then implemented them, doesn't mean it simply remains confined to the West. The ideas originated in the West, but if the ideas has the appeal and the strength, which it does, I believe, It is because it is universal. And because it is universal, people around the world want what Lars just talked about. They around the world want to be able to breathe freely, think freely, speak freely, have the freedom of conscience, have the freedom of choice of what they want to believe in and what they don't want to believe in, have the freedom to be together, to share together, or to walk away as they feel, as individual. And that is what is the most powerful idea that has been in the making of your world and my world. But then the idea has never been without a challenge. It's always been contested, because the idea that is based on individual right is, again, a fragile notion against the collective weight. And collectivism and collective and group identity is the oldest struggle. It put Socrates to death. It crucified Jesus. It struck down people who stood up to fight for what is universal. And the universal, ironically but truly, is planted in the individual, not in the collective. See? And that struggle has gone on. In the last century, the immense struggle was between the two collectivist ideology, two totalitarian foes, communism and Nazism. And against tremendous odds and at immense sacrifice, both were immediately laid to rest. They were defeated. But who would have guessed? I think any historian could have said that. But who would have guessed in the West that was in a triumphal mood after the Berlin Wall came down, that suddenly the end of history was proclaimed. And even as the end of history was being proclaimed, World Trade Tower was being attacked for the first time in 1993. And so this third immense struggle that was looming below the horizon emerged. That struggle is a struggle against Islamism. And I've always tried to make the distinction for my readers that what we are talking about is not a religion, it is a political ideology. Religions can be corrupted, religions can be taken over, religions can be hijacked. Bernard Lewis in The Crisis of Islam, which was a best-selling book that came out after 9/11, explained it beautifully. He said, just imagine if the KKK, based in Texas, were to usurp power and have the oil wealth, and then speak in the name of Christianity, and then others, because of that wealth and that power, start giving deference to the version of KKK. And that's the analogy. Islamism is a political ideology. It is a political ideology of the 20th century, born in the same way as Nazism and Soviet Marxism was born. And almost by the very same people who fertilized the ideologists of Islamism in the early part of the 20th century, whether they were Arabs or whether they were South Asians. And then that ideology now has grown into a monster. And in a way, it has grown into a monster that it is now worldwide threatening cultures and people. And in North America and in Europe, insidiously, like a Trojan horse, have entered our society. And we, that is, those who establish the civilization based upon the values of freedom and individual rights and rule of law, have, like Gulliver, bound itself with the logic of its own principle and doesn't know how now to contest with the Trojan horse that wants to basically dismantle the very system that has been the most successful system in the world, in every sense of the word, scientifically, politically, but most importantly, from my perspective, ethically and morally. And so this struggle is our struggle of our time, and it is beholden upon us whether we can take this cause, which I think is ultimately an ethical and moral cause, and win and defeat the third totalitarian enemy that is breathing down our neck. Now, people ask me, why did I do this? Why did I write about it? And recently there have been a number of engagement in the media as a result of the book coming out and as a result of some very generous and supportive reviews that have been already been published in Canada and in the United States. And so I have been receiving quite a bit of media attention. So in that sense, I've been lucky. And people ask me, why did you do this? Why did you write about it? So maybe I'll take a couple of minutes beyond if that's okay with you. And instead of rambling with my thought, just read you a few paragraphs and just lay it there. And then, you know, whatever Bjorn wants me to do, I am at his disposal. So let me quickly share with you those couple of paragraphs, because those were the questions that have been posed to me. In fact, it was posed yesterday or day before yesterday by London Free Press's own man, Joel Belanger. I don't know whether he's here in town or here in our company. And I tried to explain that to him, but also gave him the reference to the pages in my book. So here it is. I hope it won't be too long, but I've tried to be somewhat autobiographical in the last segment of my book. Immigration made the modern West more or less what it is, becoming nations of migrants and cultures, especially in the urban centers, increasingly hybrid, polyglot, fluid, and cosmopolitan. Michael Ignatieff, in reflecting on the circumstances of his family in the Russian album, writes, "This century has made migration, expatriation, and exile the norm, rootedness the exception. To come as I do from a hybrid family of white Russian exiles who married Scottish Canadians is to be at once lucky, we survived, and typical." I observed the change from the inside as I was part of the process that turned Canada from a society of almost uniform color to one that is multi-hued, from a society that was almost uniform religion to one that is multi-faithed. Now, those are the words of Neil Bissendak from 1993. I arrived in Toronto a few years after the centennial year as an immigrant refugee from war-torn South Asia. I witnessed the civil war and genocide as Pakistan tore itself apart in 1971, and was lucky to escape in the midst of the killings with my mother and younger siblings from what is now Bangladesh for shelter in my grandparents' home in my native city of Calcutta, India. My parents' generation had been uprooted by the Great Partition of India in 1947. And within a generation, my family was again thrown into the maelstrom of ethnically driven politics. The memory of the terror and savage killings that I witnessed and that nearly struck me and male members of my family down. It is a mystery to me how we survived the rapidly changing currents of organized killings by the Pakistani military and the enraged response of mobs out for revenge has remained vivid with me despite the passage of many years. In Canada, I found safety, support, and the opportunity to begin a new life with all the promise my adopted home held forth for me. In time, I came to feel uncomfortable with the notion of being a hyphenated Canadian. The part of me that belonged to the wider Indian culture, I inherited at birth without any effort on my part. But the part of me, the much greater part, through the university education I acquired and the air I breathed as I mingled with the people around me at school, in work, and in politics, became by choice and conscious effort Canadian. I'm a naturalized citizen of Canada that is an integral part of the West as a civilization distinct from other civilizations and cultures. It is this awareness of choosing to be Canadian and what this implies that has grown within me since I landed in Toronto. To be Canadian in the fullest sense means, I believe, to embrace the West and freely assimilate its distinctive culture. It means to recognize, as I did, with a mixture of awe and gratitude, that the West represents the idea of a civilization nurtured by the values of enlightenment that Kant famously defined as dare to know. Its genealogy traced back to ancient Greece, its faith tradition anchored in Judeo-Christian ethics, its politics shaped by the democratic impulse of revolution against hereditary rule, its philosophy influenced by the development of the scientific method of controlled experiments and tests, its culture open and embracing of new ideas. The sum total of these values uniquely defines the West in terms of liberal democracy. And freedom affirms the Kantian principle that man, as a free agent and a rational creature, is an end in himself and must never be treated as a means to someone else's ends. My own journey from the East to the West, has been an education that encourages putting aside those ideas and values that confine an individual to the requirements of collective identity and group solidarity, which Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab philosopher of the 14th century from North Africa, described as asabiya, to explain the rise and fall of political dynasties, and embracing the notion of individual liberty and freedom of conscience that Mill later most compellingly defended, and that are at the foundations of politics and culture to the West. The struggle between liberty and authority, Mill wrote in beginning his essay on liberty, is the most conspicuous feature in the portions of history with which we are earliest familiar, particularly in that of Greece and Rome. This struggle is the oldest and most persistent in all of human history, and is tilted in favor of the collective over the individual. In our time, this struggle has been given a new edge by the aggressiveness of those who insist on group identity over the right of the individual to be free of any coercion that limits his freedom. Across the world, as globalization has accelerated, the collectivist demand of jihad are pushing hard against the values of liberalism. This is the return of the primitive and the denial of the view that progress in history results from the daring of the few to question the consensus of the many. It is bending to the wishes of the crowd and its unwillingness to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. It is the jihad of the tribe, of the class-based or ethnic-based or religiously organized party against the ultimate minority, the solitary individual standing alone against the weight of the many. In this most primordial struggle between liberty and authority, the irony is that what is universal blossoms in the life of an individual as a free agent, and what is particular is expressed in the dogmatic defended by the collective. Arthur Koestler's novel Darkness at Noon captures this essential dilemma of human existence between ends and means, between the individual struggle for freedom of conscience and the party principle that truth is what secures and advances the collective interest. Koestler describes this conflict in a fictional setting representing Stalinist Russia to unmask the reality of totalitarian politics. Quote, "The infinite was a politically suspect quantity, the I a suspect quality. The party did not recognize its existence. The definition of the individual was a multitude of 1 million divided by 1 million. Unquote. In other words, an individual is a cog in a machine, and contrary to Kant's liberal ethics, a means to an end as defined by the collective. This is the politics of jihad, which has been the normal condition for humankind in history, and only for brief, tantalizing moments has the promise of liberty, as what ought to be the true condition for humankind, appeared on history's stage. It is in this sense that liberalism, it might be said, is a fighting creed, devoted to protecting freedom as the necessary condition for securing human dignity against the politics of jihad. I hope I didn't bore you. I wanted to share with you the thought that it was greatly memory of my own experience of having survived a genocide and having escaped the bloodshed, and then being one of those individuals that won the lottery in life to become a Canadian. And then, over the last nearly 4 decades, to see how the country that embraced me and gave me everything that I am and stand for is being abandoned slowly and in piecemeal by its political elite to embrace values from which people like me and others, countless others, are seeking to escape. Thank you.
Next question. Yes, sir.
We talk about the mosaic, but there's no such thing as a mosaic, because if you go to Toronto, the Jamaicans are here, the Chinese are here, the Japanese are here. If we don't stop it today, we're going to see the balkanization of Canada. So we're already seeing it now. And when you look to Europe and see the Balkans in Europe and the atrocities that happened there, saying what we didn't do 400 years ago, we'll do today, with the annihilation of certain groups, the same thing's going to happen in Canada. What can we do to stop it? Because it's going to go there. I fear it will go there.
Who wants to take a crack at that, Salim? You're a man of honor.
Well, look, I mean, we have to think about this with some degree of historical perspective and understanding. The world is naturally very multicultural in that sense of the word that I might use. The world is very diverse. We are living in a world that is becoming increasingly small and integrated and interdependent. And ironically, the world is in that sense a mosaic. It's a pastiche of colors. But what we're talking about is a political idea and a system of way of life and the issue of freedom, which had its birth in the West, which was nurtured in the West, and which came to define the West, which is what we're talking about: individual rights, rule of law, and those fundamental values that together make up what is liberal democracy. But why is liberal democracy appealing, or hasn't appealed? It wouldn't have an appeal if it was simply a white man's dogma. What am I doing here standing?
Yeah, exactly.
It has an appeal, and it became an appeal because it is fundamentally a universal value. So it is not the issue of reversing the mosaic or damping out the pastiche and the mosaic that exists in a natural condition. It is the question of reasserting the very system of values in terms of politics and history and philosophy that built this society, that which we have begun to abandon. I didn't come off a boat and say, whoever is a Canadian here, gentlemen, please abandon your value system and embrace mine. I didn't say that, and I don't think even the bearded folks began to say that. It was ironically the very process by which our political elite made the bargains for reasons that is ultimately self-serving.
Right.
As Ronald Reagan would say, politics and politicians are engaged in the second oldest profession, but they very often shame the oldest profession. and the bargain was to create the political vote banks.
Yeah.
And multiculturalism is nothing else, in a very crass sense, the creation of vote banks by politicians, and I discuss this in my book, and by the Liberal Party of Canada and the various left-wing parties in Europe and in the United States. By creating the vote bank, they took an edge over the people who were going to defend the fundamental values, Diefenbaker and the conservative and the values that had built up this country. And we saw the result. In all of the second half of the 20th century, they trumped the people who were going to hold those positions, to the extent that the people holding those positions became so quickly the second oldest profession, that they started now shaming the others. And so we can hardly make any distinction between which political party is going to stand up and defend the very fundamental values that made our society what it is. So it is at the realm of politics that we have to think about. And of course, the realm of politics is not simply one thing. It has got many different facets in operation. How do you get back to it? I think, you know, we have to assert, and if you look around this room, you see the generation. I have my very good friend Vaughan here, you know, I wanted to acknowledge him. You know, Vaughan is wearing an eye patch, lost in defending freedom in Europe. So where are the young folks?
Yeah, exactly.
So you guys have the memory of what you fought, of which I am the beneficiary. But it will very rapidly disappear. It's a generational thing. We are engaged in intergenerational conflict. The whole political system, school system, political party, the media has become saturated with what I call a delectable lie. It's a very pleasing lie. It is so pleasing and so seductive that we ignore its flaws, its fundamental flaws, that is basically sucking the life breath out of what is the essential. The essential to be able to speak critically, think critically, stand critically, defend values critically, because the ultimate value is the value of the individual, as I've been trying to assert. It is in an individual that you find the universal value come together. The collective is always defending its tribal interests. It was a unique experiment in the West that a system was established. It grew out of immense struggle. I told my student this morning in my class that when you're reading Locke and when you're reading Milton, you're reading 400, 500 years later, and you're reading them as if they were written for you to take the book and go to, you know, Grand Bend, sit under the shade of the tree and relax and read it with a joint in your mouth, you know, and whatever you were drinking, and think, oh, these guys are great guys, you know, or these guys don't make sense. And that's the ultimate travesty to the people who built this value system that we have. They wrote the stuff under tremendous stress. They were running away from the conflict, which is the conflict of our time also. Locke was writing his letter of tolerance in exile from Holland, you know, when England was burning, and so on and so forth. And that imagination has been lost. It has been lost, it has been given away, it has been traduced, it has been stamped upon, and it has been said that all cultures are equal, which is the defining core value of multiculturalism, that all cultures are equal. That is Pierre Trudeau. That's written into our multicultural statute by Brian Mulroney, a conservative politician. And that has become now the guiding polar star of our constitutional system. There could be nothing more of a utter trash to say that all cultures are equal. In history, never all cultures have been equal. The culture of Rome was not equal to the culture of the Vandals and the Visigoths and the Franks. Yeah. Tell me, was the culture of Rome equal to the Vandals and the Visigoths? No. Never so. And so the culture that lands man in the moon, that transforms and takes the sand, plentifully found in North Africa, in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia, and turns them into silicon chips, through which we have the amazing sciences that we have. And that culture is equal to the culture that engages in honor killing, that talks about, you know, men and women are not equal, that has no respect for minorities, that make war. And that's not simply Islam, because remember, again, historically, what is happening today in the Muslim world is going through a convulsion in this integrated, interdependent world. We've got to understand that with some degree of dispassion and understanding, and not get swept away by what ultimately will be the ultimate irony in trying to fight this totalitarian value. We become totalitarian because we then embrace a tribal value system and we abandon the very principles of liberal democracy, which is based upon individual right. Muslim world is going through a convulsion, just as the convulsion Europe went through. Where do you think you arrived from? As I was saying, when Locke was writing, when Milton was writing, when Rousseau and Mill were writing, what were they writing about? What were they talking about? Europe was in a convulsion that stretched 5 centuries, just to put a time period on it, from 1500 to right now, in the making of what you and I fervently hold as a value system. That is the respect for the individual. That is, what Kant talks about. No individual should be a means to anybody's end, which is what Stalin did. You see, this is what Hitler did, which is what Khomeini has done in Iran. Which, by the way, our governments are doing and perpetrating, which Obama is doing in the United States. And we are boastful that our troops, NATO, we participated in NATO to do what? To bomb the hell out of a thuggish monster, Gaddafi, and to replace it with what? Another group of thuggish monsters who are going to run that place. And we are going to celebrate that? And that's what we have done. And we have had no discussion. And we did it under a conservative government with which I have worked and supported. And our government and our Prime Minister did not have the courage to bring that resolution into the floor of the Parliament, which is what we're talking about, the rule of law. He did not bring the issue to the floor of the Parliament to discuss the Libyan issue, because he knew that if he brought it to the floor of the Parliament, the others would beat it, right? But that was precisely what it was necessary to do so, to show these people up for what they are. But he didn't do it. And he hasn't got rid of Section 13 from our legal system. And there are many other things. And that's precisely what individual rights is about, that I can stand up as somebody who put my money where my mouth is, and I walk the walk to elect some of the people now who are in the Parliament, and be able to criticize them that they haven't lived up to their value system, and to hold them accountable. That's what fundamental value is about, and individual rights is about, to hold them accountable. They're there to represent us. We are not there to represent them. And so we can only hold them accountable if we can maintain free speech. And there is our Prime Minister, there is our government. I cannot talk about the NDP, I cannot talk about the Liberals. I know what schmucks they are. But there is our Prime Minister. Now it's a majority government, and where is this Prime Minister taking up the issue that is the very fundamental issue that he talked about when he was the president of National Citizen Coalition, for years. And if we get suffocated and we get choked, we cannot talk about those things. And that's why Lars says it all begins with a matter of defending freedom of speech. Sorry, I didn't want to take this time.